The mare's breath came out in ragged gasps as Clara Anderson pressed her trembling hand against the animal's sweat-soaked neck, watching her younger brother convulse with fever on the rough wool blanket spread across their cabin floor. December winds howled through the gaps in the wooden walls of their homestead just outside Taylorsville, Utah, and she knew with terrible certainty that Samuel would not survive another night without medicine. The doctor who had examined him 2 days ago had been clear about the price for the quinine that could save his life, and Clara owned nothing of value except the golden Palomino mare her father had given her before he died, the horse she had raised from a foal and loved more than anything except her brother. Samuel was only 14 years old, barely old enough to help with the heavy work around their small ranch, and their mother had passed 3 years prior from pneumonia. Clara, at 22, had become mother, father, and provider all at once, struggling to keep them fed and warm through the harsh Utah winters. She had thought they might make it through this season without catastrophe, but then Samuel had fallen ill after helping their neighbor mend a fence in the freezing rain. Now his skin burned with fever, his lips cracked and bleeding, his eyes rolling back in his head as the infection ravaged his young body. Dr. Mitchell had quoted her a price of $50 for the quinine, an impossible sum that might as well have been $500. She had only $3 to her name, the remnants of selling their autumn vegetable harvest. The doctor had looked at her with something like pity and said he could not extend credit, not after too many families had left him unpaid when they moved on or died. But he had glanced out the window at her Palomino mare tied to his hitching post and mentioned that a horse trader passing through town had been looking for quality horse flesh. Clara had named the mare Sunshine when she was born on a bright April morning 5 years ago, pulled her into the world with her own hands when the birth went wrong and her father was too drunk to help. She had bottle-fed her, trained her, spent countless hours riding through the Oquirrh Mountains that rose like ancient guardians to the east of their property. Sunshine knew her voice, her touch, the exact way she liked to take the trails at dawn when the world was still soft with morning light. The mare was her companion, her solace, her connection to better days before grief and responsibility had aged her beyond her years. But Samuel was dying, and Clara would trade her own life if it meant saving his. She had walked Sunshine into town that bitter December afternoon in 1883, her throat so tight she could barely breathe, her eyes burning with tears she refused to shed in public. The horse trader was a hard-faced man named Volkov who dealt in livestock for the mining camps scattered throughout the territory. He examined Sunshine with cold efficiency, running his hands over her legs, checking her teeth, watching her move. He offered $40, and Clara knew he was cheating her but had no choice. She bargained him up to $45, knowing he would have paid twice that, and took the money with shaking hands. Sunshine whinnied as Clara embraced her one last time, pressing her face against that golden neck, breathing in the familiar smell of hay and warmth and all the rides they would never take together. She whispered promises she could not keep, apologies that would never be enough, and then forced herself to walk away before she changed her mind and let her brother die. Dr. Mitchell gave her the quinine, and she administered it to Samuel according to his instructions, spooning the bitter medicine between his cracked lips every 4 hours, holding him when he shook with chills, cooling him with damp cloths when the fever spiked. She did not sleep for 3 days, terrified that if she closed her eyes he would slip away from her. On the 4th morning his fever broke and he opened his eyes with something like clarity and asked for water in a voice that sounded almost like himself. Clara collapsed into a chair beside his bed and wept with relief and grief tangled together, grateful he would live and heartbroken over what she had given up to make it so. 3 weeks passed before Samuel was strong enough to stand without assistance, and by then winter had settled over the valley with brutal determination. Snow piled high against their cabin walls, and Clara spent her days chopping firewood, tending their small herd of cattle, and trying not to think about Sunshine. She wondered where the mare had ended up, whether she was being treated well, whether she thought Clara had abandoned her. The guilt was a physical weight she carried in her chest, making it hard to breathe on the worst days. Samuel noticed her sadness, but was too young to understand the full measure of what she had sacrificed. He knew she had sold Sunshine to pay for his medicine, but he could not comprehend what the mare had meant to her, how profoundly her absence had carved out a hollow place in Clara's heart. He tried to thank her, his thin face earnest with gratitude, but she shook her head and told him family was worth any price, which was true even as it hurt to say. January arrived with slightly warmer temperatures, the snow beginning to melt into muddy slush that made travel difficult but not impossible. Clara was mucking out the barn one gray morning when she heard hoofbeats approaching their property, an unusual sound since they lived far enough from town that visitors were rare. She set down her pitchfork and walked out into the weak sunlight, shading her eyes to see who was coming. A lone rider emerged from the tree line, sitting tall in the saddle of a bay gelding, leading another horse behind him. Clara's heart stopped as she recognized the golden coat, the white blaze down the face, the particular way Sunshine tossed her head when she was excited. For a moment she thought she was hallucinating, that grief and exhaustion had finally broken her mind, but then the rider drew closer, and she saw he was real, solid. A tall man in his mid-20s with dark hair curling from beneath his hat and eyes the color of storm clouds. He reined in his horse a respectful distance from where she stood frozen in disbelief, and when he spoke his voice was deep and careful, as though he was worried about startling her. "Afternoon, miss. I am looking for Clara Anderson. Would that be you?" She could not find words, could only stare at Sunshine, who was already pulling against her lead rope, ears pricked forward, making the soft, nickering sound she always made when she saw Clara. The man noticed her reaction, and his expression softened slightly, though his face remained otherwise unreadable. "I will take that as a yes," he said quietly. "My name is Grant Ellis. I have been tracking this mare for the better part of a month, and I believe she belongs to you." Clara finally managed to speak, though her voice came out rough and uncertain. "I sold her. She does not belong to me anymore?" Grant swung down from his horse with practiced ease, keeping hold of both sets of reins, and she could see now that he was lean and rangy, with the weathered look of someone who spent most of his time outdoors. His clothes were worn but clean, his hat battered by wind and weather, his boots scuffed from hard use. He had the bearing of a working cowboy, someone who earned his living through skill and determination rather than family money or easy circumstance. "I know you sold her," he said. "I know you sold her to Volkov for $45 to buy medicine for your brother. I know she was worth 10 times that, and I know you had no choice." He took a step closer, and Sunshine pulled harder at the rope, nearly dragging him forward. He smiled faintly and let her come closer to Clara, who reached out with trembling hands to touch the mare's face. Sunshine pressed her muzzle against Clara's palm, and the tears Clara had been holding back spilled over without permission. She stroked the mare's neck, feeling the solid warmth of her, hardly daring to believe this was real and not some cruel dream. "How did you find me?" she whispered. Grant stood quietly, giving her time to compose herself, his eyes watchful but not intrusive. "I bought her from Volkov 3 weeks ago. He was selling her to a mining outfit up north, and I happened to see her in his corral. I grew up on a ranch in Wyoming, and I know quality horse flesh when I see it. Something about her was different, though. She was trained too well, too gentle, to be just another workhorse. When I asked Volkov where he got her, he was evasive, which usually means he cheated someone." He paused, adjusting his grip on the reins as his bay gelding shifted restlessly. "I pressed him until he told me he bought her from a woman in Taylorsville who needed money for medicine. He laughed about it, said he got a bargain. That did not sit right with me. I have 3 younger sisters, and the thought of one of them forced to sell something she loved because some bastard would not show mercy made me angry." Clara looked up at him, seeing the truth of his words in the hard set of his jaw, the way his fingers tightened on the leather reins. "So you bought her from him?" "Yes." paid more than he deserved to get her away from him quickly. Then I started asking around town until I found out who you were and where you lived." He met her eyes directly, and she saw something fierce and honest there that made her chest tighten. A horse like this should be with someone who loves her. It seemed wrong for her to end up hauling ore carts in some dark mine. So I decided to bring her back. Clara shook her head, confusion mixing with hope, and something else she could not quite name. "I cannot afford to buy her from you. I still have almost nothing. Whatever you paid Volkov, I cannot repay you." Grant's expression turned almost stern, his eyebrows drawing together in a way that made him look older and more serious. "I am not asking for payment. I am returning your horse. What you decide to do with her after that is your business, but she belongs here with you." The words hung in the cold air between them, impossible and generous, and more than Clara could process. She had grown up learning that nothing came free, that every kindness had a price, that strangers did not ride for weeks through winter storms just to return a horse to someone they had never met. Yet here he stood, this Grant Ellis with his storm cloud eyes and his quiet determination, offering her back the thing she had thought lost forever. "Why?" The question came out barely louder than a breath. "Why would you do this for someone you do not even know?" He was quiet for a long moment, his gaze drifting past her to the cabin and the mountains beyond, as though searching for the right words. When he looked back at her, something vulnerable flickered across his face before he shuddered it away. "Because someone should have done it for my mother," he said simply. "She was widowed when I was 16, left with 4 children and a failing ranch. She sold everything she valued to keep us fed, including her wedding ring and the piano her father had given her. No one helped her. No one stepped in. By the time I was old enough to provide for the family, she had worked herself into an early grave." His voice roughened slightly and he cleared his throat. "I cannot undo that, but I can make sure someone else does not have to live with the same regret I carry." Clara felt something crack open inside her chest, a rush of emotion so powerful it left her dizzy. She understood loss, understood sacrifice, understood the weight of responsibility that came from protecting the people you loved. But she had not expected to find someone else who carried the same burdens, who looked at the world with the same fierce determination to make it slightly less cruel. "How is your brother?" Grant asked after a moment, his tone gentler now. "He is recovering. The medicine worked. He will be all right." She stroked Sunshine's neck again, still not quite believing the mare was really here. "Because of what I sold her for, he will live." "Then you made the right choice," Grant said firmly. "Do not let anyone tell you otherwise. But that does not mean you should have to live without her now that the crisis has passed." Samuel appeared in the cabin doorway, wrapped in a quilt, his hair standing up in all directions. He looked thin and pale, but alive, and his eyes went wide when he saw Sunshine. "Clara? Is that Sunshine? How is she here?" Clara glanced at Grant, then back at her brother. "This is Grant Ellis. He brought her back." Samuel hurried forward as quickly as his still weak legs would allow, nearly tripping over the quilt, and Grant moved instinctively to steady him. The boy looked up at the tall cowboy with undisguised wonder and gratitude. "You brought her back? Really? You just brought her back?" Grant's expression softened in a way that made him look younger, almost boyish. "Really? Your sister should not have had to give her up permanently." Samuel turned to Clara, his eyes shining. "This is the best thing that has happened in forever." Clara felt tears threatening again and blinked them back, overwhelmed by relief and joy and the sudden presence of this stranger who had turned their bleak winter into something else entirely. "Samuel, you need to get back inside before you catch cold. You are still recovering." The boy made a face but obeyed, trudging back toward the cabin with visible reluctance, looking back over his shoulder every few steps as though afraid Sunshine might vanish again. Once he was inside, Clara turned her full attention back to Grant, trying to gather her scattered thoughts. "I do not know how to thank you. This is more than anyone has ever done for us. I wish I could offer you something in return, but we have so little." Grant shook his head quickly. I told you, I do not want payment. But if you are offering hospitality, I would not say no to a hot meal and a place to sleep for the night. I have been camping rough for the past week and I am bone tired. Relief flooded through her that there was something, however small, she could offer. Of course. Please, let me take care of your horses and then I will make you supper. It is the least I can do. They worked together to unsaddle his bay gelding and settle both horses in the small barn. And Clara noticed how capable Grant was, how he moved with quiet efficiency and treated the animals with gentle respect. Sunshine kept nosing at Clara's pockets looking for the sugar cubes she used to carry, and Clara promised silently to find some for her soon. Inside the cabin, Clara busied herself preparing a meal from their limited stores, feeling self-conscious about how humble their home was, how worn and patched everything appeared. Grant seemed not to notice, settling into a chair by the fire and talking easily with Samuel about horses and ranching. Her brother was animated in a way she had not seen since before he fell ill, asking 1,000 questions about Wyoming and cattle drives and what it was like to break wild mustangs. Grant answered each question with patience and good humor, and Clara found herself watching him as she cooked, noticing the way firelight caught in his dark hair, the lines around his eyes that suggested he smiled often despite the hard life he described. He had rolled up his sleeves, and she could see the corded muscle in his forearms, the scars and calluses that spoke of physical labor and occasional danger. When she served the meal, simple stew and cornbread that felt inadequate given what he had done for them, Grant ate with obvious appreciation, complimenting her cooking in a way that sounded genuine rather than merely polite. They talked through supper about Taylorsville and the surrounding area, about the challenges of ranching in Utah territory, about the harsh winter and hopes for an early spring. As the evening wore on, Samuel began to fade, exhaustion pulling at him despite his best efforts to stay awake. Clara sent him to bed over his protests, and then it was just her and Grant sitting by the fire, the cabin quiet except for the crackle of burning wood and the wind outside. You have done a fine job taking care of him, Grant said into the comfortable silence. That is not easy at your age, being responsible for a younger sibling. Clara stared into the flames, feeling the weight of the past few years settle over her shoulders. I do what I must. He is all the family I have left. That does not make it less difficult. Grant leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. When my father died, I tried to step into his shoes, but I was just a boy. I made mistakes, lost cattle, nearly lost the ranch more than once. My mother never blamed me, but I blame myself. I still do sometimes. She looked over at him, surprised by his honesty. You said your mother passed away? His jaw tightened, and he nodded slowly. 5 years ago, pneumonia. Same thing that took your mother, if I heard right in town. Yes? The word came out soft, heavy, with shared understanding. It was brutal. Quick. I always thought if I had more money, if we could have afforded better care, maybe she would have survived. We torture ourselves with those thoughts, Grant said quietly, but sometimes death comes regardless of what we do. All we can control is how we live afterward, whether we honor them or let guilt consume us. Clara felt something loosen in her chest, a knot of tension she had been carrying for so long she had forgotten it was there. She rarely talked about her mother, about the grief and fear that had followed her death. Samuel was too young to be burdened with those feelings, and she had no close friends she trusted with her vulnerability. But here was this stranger who understood without her having to explain, who looked at her with compassion rather than pity. Where is your family now? She asked. Your sisters? A smile crossed his face, genuine and warm. Safe and settled. The eldest married a good man who owns a mercantile in Cheyenne. The middle sister teaches school. The youngest just got engaged to a rancher up near Sheridan. They are all doing well, which means I kept my promise to my mother. He paused, then added, but it also means I am free to go where I please, do what I think is right without worrying about leaving them vulnerable. Is that why you came here? Because you could? Partly. He met her eyes across the firelight, and Clara felt something spark between them, a recognition that went deeper than words. And partly because from the moment I heard about a woman who loved her brother enough to give up her most prized possession, I needed to meet her. I needed to know there were still people in the world who valued love over money. Her breath caught, and she looked away, suddenly too warm despite the winter cold seeping through the cabin walls. I am not special. Anyone would have done the same. That is not true, and I think you know it. His voice was low, intense. I have seen plenty of people choose cruelty or indifference when kindness was just as easy. You are not one of them. Clara did not know how to respond to that, to the weight of his regard, and the way her heart had started beating faster. She stood abruptly, needing movement to dispel the sudden tension. I should make up a bedroll for you. You must be exhausted. Grant stood as well, and in the small space of the cabin, they were suddenly close enough that she could see the silver threads in his gray eyes, the shadow of stubble along his jaw. He smelled like leather and wood smoke and winter air, and she found herself wanting to step closer even as her mind told her to be careful. Thank you, he said, for the meal and the hospitality, and for letting me be part of something good today. She managed to smile, though her hands trembled slightly as she pulled blankets from the chest by the wall. You are the one who made it good. We owe you everything. You owe me nothing. He took the blankets from her, his fingers brushing hers briefly, and that small contact sent heat racing up her arm. But I hope you will let me stay for a few days, help you with work around the ranch. I noticed some repairs that need doing, and I would feel better knowing everything is secure before I move on. Clara knew she should refuse, should not accept more charity, but the truth was she did need help. The roof had a leak she could not reach. The barn door hung crooked on its hinges, and a section of fence had blown down in a storm, things she had been putting off because she lacked the strength or skill to fix them properly. I would be grateful, she admitted, but only if you let me feed you properly in exchange. I will not have you working for nothing. His smile was quick and bright, transforming his serious face into something almost mischievous. Deal. He settled down by the fire with his blankets, and Clara retreated to the small bedroom she shared with Samuel, her mind spinning with the events of the day. She lay awake for a long time, listening to the cabin settle and the wind outside, thinking about storm cloud eyes and unexpected kindness and the way her life had shifted on its axis without warning. The next morning dawned clear and cold, sunlight glittering on snow-covered fields. Clara woke early as always, slipping out of bed without disturbing Samuel, and found Grant already up, feeding the fire and heating water for coffee. He looked up when she emerged, his hair rumpled from sleep, and offered a quiet greeting that felt surprisingly domestic. They worked together in easy silence, preparing breakfast and tending to morning chores, and Clara was struck by how natural it felt to have him in her space, how he seemed to anticipate what needed doing without being told. It had been so long since she had anyone to share the burden of daily labor, and she had forgotten how much lighter work felt when split between two people. After breakfast, Grant climbed onto the cabin roof to assess the leak, and Clara stood below holding tools and materials, watching him move with sure-footed confidence across the steep slope. He talked her through what he was doing, explaining how water had gotten under the shingles and what needed to be replaced. His hands were steady and skilled, and within a few hours the repair was complete, just in time for clouds to roll in and threaten more snow. Over the next 3 days, Grant worked steadily on every task that needed attention. He fixed the barn door, reinforced the fence, repaired a broken wagon wheel, and chopped enough firewood to last them through the rest of winter. Samuel followed him everywhere when he had the energy, peppering him with questions and trying to help in ways that were more enthusiastic than effective. Grant never seemed annoyed, always found something the boy could do, praised his efforts with a sincerity that made Samuel beam with pride. Clara watched them together and felt something dangerous growing in her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire, and everything to do with the man who had brought back more than just her horse. She caught herself staring at him when he was not looking, admiring the way muscles shifted under his shirt when he swung an axe, the way he laughed at Samuel's jokes, the way his eyes found hers across the yard and held for a moment too long. On the fourth evening after Samuel had gone to bed, she and Grant sat by the fire again, and the silence between them felt different, charged with things neither of them had said. "I should probably move on soon," Grant said finally, though his tone suggested he was not entirely pleased about it. "The weather is clearing, and I have been imposing on your hospitality long enough." Clara's stomach dropped, even though she had known this moment would come. "You have not been imposing. You have been helping. There is a difference. Still." He turned to look at her, and the firelight painted shadows across his face. "I do not want to overstay my welcome." She wanted to tell him he could stay as long as he wanted, that she had grown used to his presence, that the thought of him leaving made her feel hollow. But those were dangerous admissions, feelings she had no right to when he had his own life to lead. "Where will you go?" she asked instead. He shrugged, a gesture that seemed deliberately casual. "I have been drifting since my sisters were settled. Thought I might head south, see if there is work on any of the ranches in Colorado or New Mexico. I'm good with horses, and there is usually demand for trainers and breakers." "You could find work around here," Clara said before she could stop herself. "The big ranches are always hiring, and some of the farms need help with spring planting." Grant studied her for a long moment, and she saw hope flicker in his eyes before he controlled it. "Is that what you want, for me to stay nearby?" Her heart hammered against her ribs, and she knew she was at a crossroads, that what she said next would matter. She could play it safe, pretend she felt nothing, let him ride away and return to her solitary life, or she could be brave, reach for something that terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. "Yes," she whispered, "I want you to stay." The word hung between them, simple and profound, and then Grant was moving, crossing the small space to kneel in front of her chair, taking her hands in his. His palms were warm and calloused, his grip gentle but firm. "Clara," her name in his voice sounded like a prayer, "I have been trying to figure out how to tell you that leaving is the last thing I want to do. I came here to return your horse, but somewhere along the way I realized I wasn't ready to say goodbye to you either." She looked down at their joined hands, feeling tears prick her eyes. "I barely know you. This is foolish." "Maybe." He reached up with one hand to cup her cheek, his thumb brushing away a tear that had escaped. "Or maybe some things do not need time to be true. I have never believed in fate, but meeting you feels like something I was meant to do, like I have been looking for you without knowing it." Clara leaned into his touch, closing her eyes, letting herself feel the moment without overthinking it. "I am not easy to be with. I am stubborn and proud, and I have responsibilities I cannot abandon. I know, I see you." His voice was fierce with conviction. "And I still want to stay. If you will have me." She opened her eyes and found him watching her with such open honesty that it stole her breath. This man who had ridden through winter storms to return what she had lost, who had worked until his hands bled to make her life easier, who looked at her like she was precious and strong all at once. "I want you to stay," she said again, stronger this time. "Not just nearby, here, with us. If that is something you would consider." Grant's face broke into a smile so wide and genuine it transformed him, and then he was standing, pulling her up with him, wrapping his arms around her in an embrace that felt like coming home. Clara pressed her face against his shoulder and let herself hold on tight, feeling safe and wanted, and less alone than she had been in years. "I would consider it," he murmured against her hair. "I would do more than consider it." They stood like that for a long time, swaying slightly in front of the fire, neither willing to let go. When Grant finally pulled back enough to look at her, his expression was tender and searching. "I should do this properly," he said. "Court you the right way, give you time to be sure." Clara shook her head, a laugh escaping despite the tears still caught in her throat. "I do not need more time to know what I feel. I have learned that life is too short and too uncertain to waste it on caution." then I should at least ask you properly." He took both her hands again, his expression turning serious. "Clara Anderson, would you allow me to court you with the intention of marriage? Would you let me prove to you every day that I'm worthy of your trust and your heart?" The formality of the question, the weight of his sincerity, made her smile even as fresh tears spilled over. "Yes, Grant Ellis, I would like that very much." He kissed her then, soft and careful, a question and a promise all at once. Clara kissed him back, feeling years of loneliness and fear melt away in the warmth of his touch. It was not a perfect moment in a perfect place, but it was real and honest and theirs. When they finally broke apart, both slightly breathless, Grant rested his forehead against hers. "I should probably sleep in the barn from now on, for propriety." Clara laughed, the sound surprising her with its lightness. "The barn is freezing and full of holes. You will stay in the house, and we will be proper. Samuel is an excellent chaperone." "That he is." Grant smiled and pressed a kiss to her forehead before stepping back. "But I want to do right by you, by both of you. I want everyone in Taylorsville to know I respect you." She appreciated that more than she could say, understood that he was thinking about her reputation in a community where gossip could destroy a woman's standing. "Then we will court properly, whatever that means. But Grant, I am already certain." His eyes darkened with emotion, and he nodded slowly. "So am I." The next weeks unfolded like a dream Clara kept waiting to wake from. Grant found work at a large ranch 10 miles from their homestead, breaking horses for spring roundup. He spent his days there and his evenings at Clara's cabin, riding over after work to help with chores and share meals and spend time with her and Samuel. The boy adored him, saw him as the father figure he had lost too young, and Grant returned that affection with patience and genuine care. Clara found herself transformed by happiness, the constant weight of worry and exhaustion lifting slightly under the support of Grant's presence, and they talked for hours about everything and nothing, learning each other's histories and dreams and fears. She discovered he had a dry sense of humor that emerged once he felt comfortable, that he loved to read but had few opportunities, that he wanted children someday but only with someone he loved deeply. He learned that she had wanted to be a teacher before her parents died, that she loved to sketch animals and landscapes when she had time, that she sometimes felt crushed by responsibility but refused to complain because complaining felt like giving up. They fell into an easy rhythm, their courtship unfolding naturally in the midst of daily life. Grant held her hand when they walked to check fence lines, stole kisses when Samuel was not watching, told her she was beautiful when she felt worn and ordinary. Clara learned to accept his compliments, to believe that she was worth the devotion he showed so freely. In March, as the snow began to melt and early wildflowers pushed through the muddy ground, Grant brought Clara into town and bought her a ring from the general store. It was simple silver with a small blue stone, nothing fancy or expensive, but when he slipped it on her finger in the middle of Taylorsville's main street and asked her again to marry him, she said yes with her whole heart. They were married in April on a warm Saturday morning, with Samuel standing proudly as Grant's best man and half the town turning out to witness the ceremony. Clara wore her mother's best dress altered to fit and carried wildflowers that Grant had picked for her at dawn. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Grant kissed her like she was the most precious thing in the world, and Clara felt happy in a way she had thought lost to her forever. Grant moved into the cabin officially, bringing his few possessions and his bay gelding to join their small household. They fell into married life with surprising ease, working side by side to improve the ranch, to build something lasting and good. Grant proved to be everything Clara had hoped and more, a partner in every sense who shared labor and decisions, and never made her feel less than equal despite the era's expectations. By summer, they had expanded their small herd, repaired every structure on the property, and planted a kitchen garden that flourished under Clara's care. Samuel grew stronger and healthier, shooting up in height and filling out learning ranching skills from Grant with eager dedication. The boy's devotion to his new brother-in-law was absolute, and Grant returned it with unwavering commitment. One evening in late June, as they sat on the porch watching the sun set behind the mountains, Clara told Grant she was pregnant. His face went through a dozen emotions before settling on fierce joy, and he pulled her into his arms with a gentleness that made her heart ache. "We are going to be a real family," he whispered against her hair, "a whole family." "We already are," Clara said, placing her hand over his where it rested on her still flat stomach. "We have been since the day you brought Sunshine home." Grant pulled back to look at her, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "That was the best decision I ever made, following that instinct, tracking down your story, finding you. Everything good in my life now traces back to that choice." Clara cupped his face in her hands, marveling at how this man had become her entire world in such a short time. "You saved me. Not just by bringing back my horse, but by reminding me that I deserved kindness, that I did not have to carry everything alone. You saved me too," he said fiercely, "gave me purpose and belonging when I was drifting, made me believe in the future again." They sat together as darkness fell, planning for the baby, for their expanding life, for all the years they would have together. Clara thought about how close she had come to losing everything, how one terrible winter had nearly destroyed her. But from that darkness had come Grant, tracking a golden Palomino mare through the snow, refusing to let one act of sacrifice be the end of her story. Their daughter was born in February of 1885, during a snowstorm that reminded Clara painfully of the winter she had almost lost Samuel. But this time she was not alone. Had Grant beside her holding her hand, encouraging her, and Samuel waiting anxiously in the other room. The baby came into the world squalling and healthy, with her father's dark hair and her mother's determined chin. They named her Grace for the unearned gift that had brought her parents together. As Clara held her daughter for the first time with Grant's arm around her shoulders and Samuel peering down at his new niece with wonder, she felt a completeness she had never expected to know. Her life had been hard and marked by loss, but it had also brought her here, to this moment, to this family that existed because she had loved her brother enough to sacrifice everything, and Grant had been brave enough to care. Sunshine whinnied from the barn, as though sensing the importance of the moment, and Grant laughed quietly. "I should go tell her she's part of a bigger family now." "Later," Clara said, leaning into his warmth, watching her daughter's tiny fingers curl and uncurl. "Stay here with us for now." So he stayed, and they sat together in the lamplight, a family forged from hardship and held together by love, while winter wind howled outside and the future stretched before them full of promise. The years that followed were not without challenges, but they faced each one together. The ranch prospered slowly, steadily, through hard work and careful planning. They added rooms to the cabin as their family grew, welcomed a son in 1887 who they named Thomas after Grant's father, and another daughter in 1890 named Rose for the wild flowers that had been in Clara's bridal bouquet. Samuel grew into a strong young man, eventually building his own cabin on the far side of their property with Grant's help. He married a school teacher from town in 1892, a kind woman named Margaret who became like a sister to Clara. The families remained close, sharing meals and work and raising their children to know the value of loyalty and sacrifice. Grant proved to be as devoted a father as he was a husband, spending hours teaching his children to ride, telling them stories, showing them how to care for animals and land with respect. He never forgot where he came from or what had brought him to Utah, and he raised his children to understand that kindness was not weakness and generosity was its own reward. Clara watched her family flourish and felt grateful every single day for the golden mare that had started everything. Sunshine lived to be 19 years old, healthy and beloved until the end. And when she finally passed peacefully in her sleep, Clara and Grant buried her in the meadow where the wildflowers grew thickest. They marked the spot with a cairn of river stones, and every year on the anniversary of the day Grant had brought her home, the family would ride out to that meadow and remember. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Clara and Grant took a rare day away from the ranch, riding up into the Aquir Mountains to a spot they had discovered years before, a high overlook where you could see the valley spread out below like a patchwork quilt. They sat together in the grass, older now, but no less in love, watching clouds cast shadows across the land. "Do you ever regret it?" Clara asked, leaning against Grant's shoulder. "Giving up your freedom to tie yourself to a struggling ranch and a woman with a mountain of responsibilities?" Grant turned to look at her, his storm cloud eyes as clear and honest as they had been the day they met. "Not for one single second. You and this life we have built are everything I ever wanted, even before I knew to want it." Clara smiled, reaching up to touch the silver threading through his dark hair, the lines around his eyes that spoke of laughter and hard work. "I love you. I have loved you since you rode up to my cabin with my horse and refused to take payment, but I will love you even more deeply every year for the rest of my life." "That is my line," Grant said, pulling her closer. "I saw you standing in front of your barn, covered in mud and exhausted, and still beautiful, and I knew I was in trouble. By the time I rode away 3 days later, I was completely gone. You had my heart before you ever knew you wanted it." They kissed there on the mountain, with the wind singing through the pines and the sun warm on their faces, two people who had found each other through chance and choice and sheer determination. Below them, their ranch spread out in neat fields and sturdy buildings, evidence of 2 decades of partnership and love. Their children were there somewhere, probably arguing about chores or playing with the horses, growing up secure in the knowledge that they were wanted and cherished. "Thank you," Clara said when they finally pulled apart, "for tracking down a horse when any reasonable person would have just sold her and moved on, for being unreasonable in the best possible way." Grant laughed, the sound rich and warm. "I prefer to think of it as being reasonable about what really matters. Money comes and goes, but having you in my life, that is worth more than gold." They stayed on the mountain until sunset painted the sky in shades of amber and rose, talking about their children and their dreams and all the years still ahead of them. When they finally rode home in the gathering darkness, their ranch lights were visible from miles away, warm and welcoming, a beacon guiding them back to everything they had built. Samuel met them at the barn, now a 30-year-old man with a family of his own, but still the same boy who had watched in wonder as Grant returned sunshine all those years ago. "Ma wanted me to make sure you got home safe," he said, grinning. "She worries when you're out late?" "Margaret is a treasure," Clara said, dismounting with Grant's help. "Tell her we are fine, and we will see everyone tomorrow for Sunday dinner." After Samuel left, Clara and Grant tended to their horses together, moving with the practiced ease of people who had performed these tasks side by side thousands of times. When they finally walked to the house, Grant took her hand, lacing their fingers together. 20 years, he said softly, "and I would do it all again in a heartbeat." "So would I," Clara replied, squeezing his hand. "Every hard winter, every struggle, every moment of doubt, all of it was worth it to end up here with you." Inside, their children were already in bed, the house quiet except for the crackle of embers in the fireplace. Clara and Grant moved through their nighttime routine, banking the fire, checking doors, preparing for another day. When they finally climbed into bed, Clara curled against Grant's side, her head on his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "I am glad you found me," she whispered into the darkness. His arm tightened around her, holding her close. "I will always find you, in any lifetime, in any circumstance. You are my home, Clara." She smiled against his shirt, feeling the truth of his words settle into her bones. They had built something real and lasting, a love that had weathered every storm and grown stronger for it. It had started with a golden Palomino mare and a cowboy who refused to let an injustice stand, but it had become so much more, a testament to what was possible when two people chose each other every single day. As sleep pulled at her, Clara thought about that terrible winter when she had sold sunshine, the lowest point of her life that had somehow led to the greatest joy. She thought about the girl she had been, exhausted and alone, and convinced she would never have more than survival. That girl would never have believed how rich her life would become, how full of love and laughter and purpose, but it had happened, was still happening, would continue for all the years they had left. Because Grant had seen a mistreated horse and followed the trail back to its owner, because he had believed in kindness when cruelty would have been easier, because he had looked at Clara and seen someone worth crossing the territory for. The next morning dawned bright and clear, promising a beautiful late spring day. Clara woke to find Grant already up, standing by the window watching the sunrise paint the mountains gold. She joined him, wrapping her arms around his waist, and he covered her hands with his. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "How lucky I am," he said simply. "How every choice I made led me here, to you, to this life. I could have ignored Volkov's story, could have decided it was not my business, could have sold the mare to someone else and moved on. But I did not, and because of that, I have everything." Clara turned him to face her, looking up into the face she loved more than any other. "We both made choices. I chose to trust you, to let you stay, to take a chance on love even when it terrified me. We built this together." "Together," Grant agreed, kissing her softly. "Always together." And they were. Through every season that followed, every challenge and triumph, every moment of joy and sorrow that makes up a life fully lived, they grew old together on their ranch, watched their children have children, became pillars of the Taylorsville community they had helped build. When people asked how they had met, Grant would tell the story of tracking a golden Palomino mare through winter snow, and Clara would add how he had appeared like something out of a dream, refusing payment and offering kindness instead. Their children heard the tale so many times they could recite it from memory, but they never tired of it, never stopped seeing the love that shone in their parents' eyes when they looked at each other. The ranch that had nearly broken Clara through loneliness and struggle became a place of abundance and warmth, known throughout the territory as a place where fair dealing and hard work were rewarded, where family came first, where strangers in need were treated with generosity. It was the legacy Grant and Clara built together, a reflection of the values that had brought them together in the first place. On winter evenings when snow fell soft and quiet outside, Clara would sometimes walk out to the barn and stand where she had first seen Grant riding up with sunshine. She would remember that moment of disbelief and hope, the way her world had shifted in a single instant. Then Grant would come looking for her, wrap his coat around her shoulders, and they would stand together looking at the stars, grateful for everything they had been given and everything they had made. Years later, when they were both gray-haired and weathered, sitting on their porch watching their grandchildren play in the yard, Clara said, "I never thanked you properly for everything you gave up to be here, for choosing us over your freedom." Grant took her hand, his grip still strong despite the arthritis that made his fingers ache. "You have thanked me every day by being you, by building this life with me, by giving me a reason to wake up grateful. I gave up nothing, Clara. I gained everything." She leaned her head on his shoulder, watching their youngest granddaughter chase chickens while their grandson tried unsuccessfully to rope a fence post. "Do you remember that first night sitting by the fire when you told me you were not ready to say goodbye?" "I remember everything about those days," Grant said. "Every word, every look, every moment I fell more in love with you." "I knew then," Clara admitted, "even though I tried to be cautious, tried to protect myself. I knew you were going to change my life. I was terrified and hopeful all at once." "Fear and hope," Grant mused. "That is what makes us brave, I think. Feeling both and choosing hope anyway." Clara lifted her head to look at him, seeing past the lines and gray hair to the young cowboy who had appeared in her darkest hour. "You made me brave, made me believe I deserved happiness. "You always deserved it," he said firmly. "I just got lucky enough to be the one who could give it to you." They sat in comfortable silence as afternoon faded to evening, their family around them, their land stretching out in all directions, a testament to faith and love and the willingness to take chances. It was more than Clara had ever dreamed possible that terrible winter when she sold her beloved horse, more than Grant had imagined when he decided to track that horse down and return it. But it was real, solid, theirs. A life built on the foundation of one man's decision to choose kindness, one woman's courage to accept help, and the love that grew from those simple acts into something extraordinary. As stars began to appear in the darkening sky, their children called them in for supper, and Grant helped Clara to her feet with the same gentleness he had always shown. They walked hand in hand into their home, surrounded by the noise and warmth of family, and Clara sent up a silent prayer of gratitude for golden Palomino mares, for winter storms, for cowboys who refused to leave well enough alone, for Grant, who had tracked her horse and found her heart, and who had spent every day since proving that some fairy tales were real, even in the harsh practical world of the American West, for the love that had saved them both and given them a future neither could have imagined alone. Together they had built something lasting, something true, something worth every sacrifice and struggle that had brought them to each other. And as they sat down to dinner with their family gathered around them, Clara looked across the table at Grant and saw her whole world reflected in his smile. It had all started with a horse, but it had become a lifetime, and that lifetime was far from over. They still had years ahead of them, years to spend loving each other, supporting their family, and being grateful for the day a cowboy decided that some things mattered more than profit or convenience. That night, lying in bed with Grant's arm around her, Clara thought about how strange and wonderful life could be, how tragedy could lead to joy, how loss could become gain, how a single act of kindness could ripple out and change everything. She had traded her beloved horse to save her brother's life, had thought that sacrifice would haunt her forever. Instead, it had brought her the greatest gift she would ever receive. Not just the horse returned, but the man who returned it. The husband, the father, the partner who had stood beside her through everything and made every burden lighter by sharing it. "I love you," she whispered into the darkness. "I love you too," Grant replied, his voice rough with sleep. "Until my last breath and beyond." Clara smiled and let herself drift off, secure in the knowledge that tomorrow would bring new challenges and new joys, and she would face all of it with Grant beside her. The way they had faced everything since that cold December day when he had ridden into her life with a Palomino mare and a heart full of determination. Their story would be told for generations in the Ellis family, passed down as an example of how love could emerge from hardship, how choosing compassion over profit could lead to riches beyond measure. Children would grow up hearing about the woman who loved her brother enough to give up her most prized possession, and the cowboy who loved them both enough to bring it back. And every time the story was told, it would end the same way, with two people who had found each other against all odds, who had built a life of meaning and purpose, who had proven that even in the hardest times, in the roughest places, love could not only survive but flourish. The ranch they built together would stand for generations, passing through their children to their grandchildren and beyond, a living monument to Grant and Clara's love. The land would be cared for with the same values they had instilled, the same commitment to family and community and doing what was right, regardless of cost. And somewhere in that meadow where wildflowers grew thick every spring, where a cairn of river stones marked a special grave, the spirit of a golden Palomino mare would run free, the creature whose sale and return had set all of this in motion. Sunshine had been loved by Clara, tracked by Grant, and remembered by everyone who came after as the horse that had started it all. But more than the horse, more than the ranch, more than any material thing they accumulated, Grant and Clara's true legacy was the love they shared and the example they set. They showed their children and grandchildren what partnership looked like, what it meant to choose each other every day, what could be built when two people committed fully to each other's happiness. As years turned to decades, as the 1800s gave way to a new century, Grant and Clara remained constant in their devotion. They aged gracefully together, their love deepening with time rather than fading. They celebrated 50 years of marriage surrounded by children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, a sea of faces that existed because they had found each other. On that anniversary, Grant stood to make a toast, his hand shaking slightly but his voice strong. 50 years ago, I made the best decision of my life when I asked Clara Anderson to be my wife. Every day since has been a gift, every moment with her a treasure. I would do it all again, exactly the same, just to end up here with all of you and near. Clara wiped tears from her eyes as their family cheered, overwhelmed by gratitude and love. She thought about that scared young woman she had been, alone and desperate, convinced her life would be nothing but struggle. She wished she could go back and tell that girl what was coming. That help was on the way in the form of a dark-haired cowboy with storm cloud eyes and a heart bigger than the territory. But maybe not knowing had been part of the gift. Maybe the surprise of it, the unexpected nature of grace, had made it all the more precious. When the celebration ended and their family had gone home, Grant and Clara sat together on their porch one more time, holding hands in the darkness. They were old now, their bodies worn from decades of hard work, but their hands still fit together perfectly, fingers interlaced like they had been thousands of times before. "No regrets?" Clara asked, the question she had asked before but never tired of hearing answered. "Not a single one," Grant replied, bringing her hand to his lips. "You?" "Only that I did not have more years to give you," Clara said softly. "However many we get will never feel like enough." Grant pulled her closer, tucking her against his side. "Then we will make every day count, just like we always have." And they did. Until Grant passed peacefully in his sleep at the age of 83, with Clara beside him holding his hand. And until Clara followed him 18 months later, her children gathered around her bed as she smiled and whispered his name one last time before closing her eyes. They were buried side by side on their ranch, in the meadow with the wildflowers and the cairn of stones that marked Sunshine's grave. 3 simple markers standing together, a family reunited in the earth they had loved and worked and built upon. Their descendants continued the ranch for generations, each one hearing the story of how it all began, how a woman named Clara had sacrificed everything to save her brother, how a cowboy named Grant had refused to let that sacrifice be permanent, how love had grown from kindness, and kindness had changed everything. It was a story worth telling, worth remembering, worth carrying forward into the future, because it was true in the deepest sense, a testament to what humans were capable of when they chose compassion and courage over comfort and convenience. The golden Palomino mare named Sunshine had started it all, but Grant and Clara had built it, nurtured it, and turned it into something that would outlast them both. A legacy of love that would echo through the ages, reminding everyone who heard it that sometimes the greatest treasures come from the hardest sacrifices, and sometimes the best things in life arrive when we least expect them, carried by someone brave enough to care.